always been used solely as a grazing area. So the actual grass structure and the species composition in the grasses is pretty much as it would have been in a sort of natural, all natural situation. Because it's a trout farm, and because when my younger sister and her husband brought shares into this place nearly 40 years ago and invited us over, this was my first exposure to fly fishing. And for many, many years, this was the core part of my involvement with our farm. Whenever we went, I'd spend incredible numbers of hours just fishing. And fishing for me is just waving a rod around and maybe catching something, but watching everything around you and enjoying the birds flying over and listening to the calls. So it's a wonderful, immersive experience. And we graduated to a boat, which subsequently has gone up in smoke. But again, long periods out on the water, which gave you access particularly to all the birds flying over. And I've had some incredible sightings while fishing. But we also used to go walking. And in 2005, we were wrapping up a long walk, heading back home, and we came across the very first orchid that we'd found in the area. And I remember it quite vividly because Cynthia at that stage was already fairly into plants, but I knew what this thing was. And she was really miffed because she was the plant person and I'm not supposed to know about pretty things like flowers. Anyway, that was the start of a whole new chapter in how we got to understand and value this incredible area around us. So we now spend far more time out in the grasslands than we do even down near the main dam in front of our own house. And this is the kind of strange sort of posturing that the flower people get up to. And this is why the farmers actually probably think we're completely insane. But it's really amazing what happens when you actually start getting down at this level. And I found that as our interest has gradually evolved and now includes things like not just orchids, but other flowering plants, because you're looking for plants, we're seeing more snakes on our walks, which is probably a good thing, because otherwise we probably would have been stepping on them. But we also now are seeing things like insects, spiders, and all the rest of it as well. So every walk is now that much more rewarding on so many new and different levels. So obviously, initially, I've always been a birder. And so a large part of the early charm and attraction of the area around our farm were the birds themselves. And in that kloof area, which I showed in one of the early pictures, we have a small colony of bald ibis, up to about 9 pairs nest in the kloof. And this was a particularly accommodating bird, which actually sat on the nest and allowed me to take pictures from not more than about 20 meters away, which is not normally what they do. The bush also produces things like bush blackcap, which is an endemic species, which is largely associated with the Drakensberg, the eastern escarpment. And we have up to 2 pairs that breed in that little patch of, excuse me, of kloof bush. The river system and our dam attracts a variety of water birds, including things like half-collared kingfisher, but also we've got breeding little bittern. 14 years ago, no, sorry, more than that now, it was probably closer to 17 years ago. For 3 seasons in a row, we had a rufous-bellied heron visit the dam. And the great thing about the place is that we literally cannot ever rule anything out. We keep seeing new species almost every trip. One of the newer birds to actually start showing itself on a more regular basis has been the European honey buzzards. And we've seen several individuals around on our farm. And those of you who attended that talk probably 2 years ago now will remember that there seems to have been a really interesting increase in the numbers of European honey buzzards that are reaching South Africa. When you think grasslands, and particularly when you think Mpumalanga grasslands, there are a number of very important conservation priority species. And the yellow-breasted pipit is another red data listed endemic species. We don't see this thing very often, but it's a bird that over the last couple of years seems to be becoming more regular in the area of our farm. And then encouragingly, particularly because of the fact that generally vultures in Africa are on the back foot, we are seeing increasing numbers of Cape vultures over our farm. And on one occasion, we had 48 birds roosting south of the farm on Eskom power lines. And then as it warmed up, the whole bunch actually started taking off and thermaling up and then heading north directly over our farm. So it's always encouraging when you start seeing birds like this. Everywhere else, the news is grim, but we tend to be seeing these birds more and more frequently and in increasingly high numbers as well, which is, for me, a positive sign. So all of these are going on. And 5 years ago, for the first time ever, we were walking in the valley running south from the Bachendal War Memorial, and I suddenly looked across the valley and there were a pair of wattle cranes feeding in the grassland. And this has become a regular feature of that valley. And initially we were very puzzled. We didn't realize where or couldn't figure out where the birds were coming from. And it's finally sort of been, shall we say, worked out that they are probably the birds that breed at Larkenvlei, which is on the road between Belfast and Dullstroom. And what's fascinating is that at a time where the adult female had lost her mate, unfortunately the male had flown into one of the Eskom power lines, we suddenly had not one bird, but actually 3 wattled cranes pitch up in the valley behind us. And our highest count since then has been 4 birds in the valley at the same time. So this has been a really big thing. When you think that the total wild population of wattled cranes in Southern Africa is somewhere of the order of maybe 250, 280 birds, to have 4 of them in this valley directly behind us is pretty amazing. And it was this range of new sightings, of red data sightings, which first put me in touch with a guy called Mervyn Lotter, who works for Mpumalanga Conservation. He's in their GIS department, and it's his job to actually map out the distributions of red data species across the board. So that's plants, insects, birds, mammals, whatever. And so since those early days, I've been supplying Mervyn with detailed sightings, locations, GPS coordinates of sightings of birds like the pipits, like the wattled cranes, like the white-bellied korans, which we have in our area as well, like the half-collared kingfishers, the 2 otter species, which are thankfully quite welcome on our dam. Most of our shareholders are far more nature-oriented than fishing-oriented now, so they don't mind watching the otters take the odd trout. But then there are other birds as well, things like common quail. And for those of you who've not walked in grassland before, this is a bird which will probably take years off your life, because you're walking along, you may even be chatting amongst yourselves, so you're certainly not in stealth mode. And as your foot is coming down on one of these birds, it erupts literally from under your foot, and it goes off with a whirring of wings, and your heart stops, and you probably say something I'm probably giving you a slightly more polite version, but it's something like shit. And you hear this little quail, this common quail, beetling off ahead of you, going shit, 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 shit. And he disappears, and you take a few seconds to get your pulse back somewhere into the normal area, and you carry on walking. So that's the one bird, but there's another one in these grasslands which is even more exciting and more important, and that is a bird called the black rump button quail. And we have been seeing or hearing black rump button quails now for a number of years. And when I first put the first records through to Mervyn, he was really impressed and very pleased, because in his GIS system, he has virtually no locations for the species. And it is also a species of conservation concern. So all of this data is now going in, it's building up their knowledge of what's in the valley. It's actually giving them new distribution records for red data species within the province. And what has come out of that is a growing awareness of the value of that valley. Now, when we first made contact with Mervyn, the Steenkampsberg IBA actually stopped at the northern boundary of our farm. And so our farm, which is not that great, I mean, we've had a lot of these red data birds on our farm, but it's more the surrounding farms, they were not initially included under the IBA. And what's happened because of all the records we've been able to submit of things like insects and birds and mammals and plants and orchids in particular, we've actually got them to actually refuse coal mining exploration in the section of valley that we most commonly walk over. So it's been quite fantastic. You know, all of that work we've done, which is absolute pure joy and pleasure, instead of us just sitting on a list of what for us is nice to have data, we've actually made sure it's got through to somebody who can actually use it effectively. And as a result, that whole area is slightly better off in terms of its conservation prospects. Other birds that pitch up, particularly in winter when they start burning fire breaks, are things like the black-winged lapwings. And there are also a fairly good collection of mammals. We get plenty of aardvark sign whenever we walk. There's often fresh burrowing going on. We've even had them coming in and digging up the garden around the house. Things like suricates or meerkats and also yellow mongoose. And then the larger mammals are things like common reedbuck, mountain reedbuck, blesbuck, of course, which are introduced on many of the farms. There's springbok, there's duiker and steenbuck. And then things like Jamison's red rock rabbit and nice stuff like that, jennets. And blackback jackals are becoming quite common as well. I mentioned blesbuck, so it's a beautiful, you know, wide open valley, lovely grassland. And this is a gray redbuck, which is an endemic antelope to Southern Africa and also a red-listed mammal species. Okay, and then we even had a hippo. And somebody was asking me the other day, is it the same hippo that's now causing hassles in Fourways? I don't think so. It's a long way to walk from Belfast to Joburg. But this thing pitched up completely unexpectedly and unannounced in our trout dam a couple of years ago. Okay, so that's a little bit of more or less where it started, but then because you're walking and looking for birds, you do tend to come across stuff which is just drop dead gorgeous and beautiful. And these scarlet river lilies growing on the banks of a little stream coming out of that grassland are just one of those things that, you know, you kind of, when you become too focused on in your pursuit of, say, just birds, you overlook all this other stuff around you. And then as you start opening your eyes to the pretty flowers, you come across this incredible thing, which is a dwarf sugar bush, which grows creeping over the rocks. It doesn't actually sort of grow higher than about 20 to 30 centimeters off the ground. And it has these exquisite flowers. Um, and so, you keep noticing new things. And then because you're looking at flowers, suddenly you start seeing more butterflies, and not just the big showy butterflies, but sometimes quite small and quite tricky butterflies like this Leidenberg copper, which is a fairly widespread species. But in the same family, there are a number of highly localized and highly threatened butterfly species, which are totally reliant on a combination of the presence of a specific food plant for the larvae, for the caterpillar, and a type of ant, which acts almost as a guard and a caretaker for the larvae. So keeping your eyes open and checking out all the butterflies is important, because you could find one of those very localized red data listed species as well. This is a geranium water bronze, and again, not a particularly important butterfly in the context of conservation status, but just something else, something exquisite. It's tiny. It's about, maybe the size 1.5 times the size of a thumbnail. And it's just so beautifully subtle in its colors and its markings. And I mentioned the fact that we are walking slower, we're looking around, we're looking on the ground, we're looking in the air, and we've suddenly started finding a lot more snakes, mostly harmless snakes like this spotted scarpsteker, but we've also come across quite a few puff adders and also night adders on our walks. And I'm happy to say that in all cases, there was no blood lost on either side. We were able to enjoy and then move on without having any sort of serious confrontations. So this little night adder was actually on a little rocky hill close to where the house is. And then skinks. I'm still trying to identify this skink. They're really quite tricky. Although this particular animal looks so distinctive, I can't understand why the experts aren't rushing to fill in the blanks. But yeah, so these are the kinds of things that have kept us going and kept us looking. And as each new sort of page opens or turns over, it's almost like the rate at which you see new stuff accelerates. So your eyes are now tuned to different things, you're picking up different things, and suddenly we're finding more orchids. We found our first orchid in 2005, and in mid-December, Cindy and I finally found an orchid that we expected to be in the area. We finally found it, and that brought us up to 31 species in the sort of 5K radius of our farm. And just to give you some idea of the kind of variety of these ground orchids, these are two dizers. The one on the left is a one of the few orchids with a common name, and that's orange and yellow candles. And then the one on the right is a dizer called Dizer cooperi. They are very widespread and found over a wide range of different habitats. And then the most widespread genus of orchids, as one would expect in pure grassland, are these habanerias. And habanerias are typically very green, predominantly green orchids with amazingly intricate flowers, some of them really, really crazy intricate. And they basically blend in with the grasslands very, very well indeed. So while those bigger dizers would be quite easy to pick up at quite a distance, you almost have to step on these habanerias before you can see them. And then tucked down either in the leaf litter, in the kloof, or the orchid on the left, or in the sort of damp, marshy grass, are two disparate species. Anthoceros, the white one on the left, grows in leaf litter under the trees. And then the Dispris tysoni is a beautiful little mudderkoppie that grows in damp grassland areas. So all of these now are being logged. Every time we find a new population of these orchids, I plot them on Google Earth. I actually send them off to Mervyn, and that database of red data and other key species is constantly being expanded and updated. And as I was saying, it's just incredible when you really start looking, you know, your focus changes. You're not looking for something bird-shaped and calling or covered in feathers. You're looking at color, you're looking for movement, you're looking for anything in the grass. And now you actually start picking up these little gems. And this is a delightful little creature, the first box kite spider that I've ever seen. And most of us have probably, if you've done any birding in Bushveld, particularly if you walk near the front of the group, you'll probably have come across those beautiful little kite spiders that actually are hanging from the thorn trees. This was actually in the grass, and it looked like a little baked enamel ornament. It really had that sort of texture and sheen to it. All right, so when you start looking, for one thing, it often leads you in a completely different direction or in an expanded direction. And just a couple of weeks back over that sort of weekend of the 16th of December, I could hear red-chested flufftails calling at the inflow to our dam in front of the house. And this has been an ambition of mine to photograph this bird for probably close to 40 years. So I took the cameras and I went and sat down in the marsh getting chewed alive by mosquitoes. And I heard these birds calling around me. On one occasion, I saw a head pop up. On another occasion, the bird flew across from one side to the other, but not a chance of getting any kind of picture. But while I was in the wetland and looking around, killing time and waiting for miracles to happen, there were a lot of little damselflies and dragonflies active around me. And just in that 2 days that I spent trying to get the picture you see on screen, I added 5 new dragonfly and damselfly species to our farm. So this is what I was talking about. When you actually sort of broaden your vision, open your eyes, look around, you start seeing so much more, and it's almost like a sort of exponential growth curve. And this same weekend, we were in a wetland, a little seep area in that grassland that I photographed, showed you the photograph of earlier. And we came across a population of an orchid we thought had actually been completely wiped out. It was on the neighboring farm, and the farmer had actually opened up a new maize field. And the only place we'd found this particular orchid, not the one on screen, but a different one, was completely destroyed. And we thought, well, that's it. We'll never see that orchid around again. And on this visit, we were actually walking around the seepage zone, and we suddenly found a really healthy population of these beautiful little hanging yellow orchids, looking almost like a bunch of freesias. And we were really chuffed that we hadn't lost them. And I kind of jokingly said to Cynthia, I reckon we should look for Neobelusia, because, if, you know, we're obviously, luck is with us. And as I said it, Cynthia said, here they are. And this is the orchid I mentioned earlier that we'd been looking for many, many years. And we found a wonderful population of over 20 of these plants growing down in the grass. Each flower is about the size of a thumbnail. So it really is tiny. And you literally almost have to step on these things, otherwise you'll miss them completely. So that was brilliant. And then, as I mentioned earlier, that weekend was memorable for the number of new dragonfly and damselfly species. This was the first time I had ever seen a spread wing damselfly at De Rust. And you can see why they get the name spread wing. Damselflies usually sit with their wings folded along the body, not out to the sides like dragonflies. And this butte is a thing called a Highland spread wing. And these are tropical blue tails actually mating. And this is where all of this stuff is now feeding off itself and growing. As each trip we go, we learn more. We know now to look out for something new, and while we're looking for that, something else pops up. And this is a rather large dragonfly called a stream hawker. Again, one of the ones that we saw for the first time on that weekend. Okay, so all of this data goes through, and when you develop an interest in things, you typically read. So we have looked through orchid books, we've studied, we actually have found stuff that we desperately keen, to see, which is now high on our bucket list. And one of the really interesting orchids that we actually came across very early on in our kind of growing study of the orchids around Belfast was this one here. And this is an orchid known as Habenaria anguiceps, which anguiceps means snake head. And the flower spike, which is only about 30 centimeters tall, from above looks like there are a whole lot of snakes twirled around the stem with their heads radiating out at different levels. And why this caught our eye was the fact that in the only field guide we had available at that stage, there was a feature on this orchid mentioning that it had been collected at Bachendal. And 123 years later, Cindy and I were wrapping up a stay at the farm. We'd gone on a very long walk. And I said, look, we need to just sweep by and see if we can get another record of the black rump button quails in that area where we've been seeing them on this trip, because it was a new atlas card. And the more frequently you record a species, a red data species on your atlas cards, the higher value that area has from a conservation perspective. Anyway, we took a bit of a sweep, a detour, and we were pushing it quite hard because there was a storm brewing. And literally, as the storm broke, we were running back home. We were about 1 kilometer from the house, and I nearly stood on one of these orchids. So 123 years after it had been collected, it had been searched for in the area subsequently, and no one could find it. And yet, by pure fluke, simply because we'd gone out of our way to go and try and record the black rump button quails again, we managed to find a small population of Habenaria anguiceps. So that data has all, again, been added to Mervin's database. And the big threat from a grassland perspective, we hoped was going to be now permanently averted by the fact that this area had a very high value, and it was recognized. And then about 6 months ago, we were informed that there's an application to put a 120 wind turbine wind farm in the valley south of us. And that obviously has incredible threat to things like your Cape vultures, your white-bellied corans, your wattled cranes, blue cranes, which also occur in the area, and certainly your bald ibis could also potentially be at risk from that development. So it's a little bit ironic that this whole process, this whole wonderful experience that Cindy and I have shared, learning more and more about grasslands and the diversity that they contain, and feeding back those discoveries into the conservation process so that people would be aware of what was going on in that valley, and getting to the point where we were probably going to be safe from coal mining applications. And now we already have a so-called green alternative energy, which is going to pose a threat to many of the bird species in particular that I've mentioned. So we're back to square one. The good news is that the guy who's doing the actual bird research on the site is somebody I know and I trust. He knows what he's doing. He also, as a precursor to his own work, actually went into the SABAP2 database and saw immediately that I had submitted a tremendous amount of data. I think I've actually submitted close to 100 cards for the risk square, the square in which our farm is based. And he's using that plus information I've added, which I've given to him in addition, to actually formulate his response, his bird-based response to this application. But as I said, it's ironic for me that a green alternative energy source could end up doing a lot of harm, particularly to the bird life, which has given us so much pleasure over the years. And that's it, folks. Any questions?
Wow. Okay, Geoff, thank you very much indeed for that walk through the grasslands. Your orchids are so much more exciting than the ones I wrote about that I kind of made up. We've got Dr. Simeon Bazeng, who's an employee, or he works at BirdLife South Africa, but Simi, you're a botanist, eh? So all of these lovely names would mean a lot to you. Do you have any questions for Geoff?
Yes, thank you so much, Linda, and thank you, Geoff, for that brilliant presentation. Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. You're cutting in and out a bit, but I can hear you.
Okay, so sorry. Okay, I'll try to speak louder. It's really impressive to see the kind of work you're doing, and it cuts across a lot of what I'm trying to support. We work to support other African countries to notice, and in countries like Gabon, where we work predominantly in, you find vast fields of land, which are super important for biodiversity, and like shown, that have been made to plant palms, and the biodiversity is somewhat lost and is not accounted for, and in many cases it's found on the land. But that's just to comment your talk, and we read government perspective. I'm a trained and I look as if plans that party. Do you have any? Was that clear?
Simi, your audio is coming in and out, so I'm not sure whether Geoff heard you. Geoff, did you manage to pick up that question?
I didn't pick up the question at the end. I think, you know, that...
I can try to type it out.
Okay.
Yeah.
If you can capture it, Linda, and then pass it on, that would be great. Thank you. But just from my side, I think, you know, one of the things that the Atlas has shown us is the value of citizen science.
Yep.
And the biggest advantage that we have over the professionals is, firstly, compared to them, we have virtually unlimited time and unlimited resources. Yep. And in the case of this particular area that I've been describing to you this evening, this has been an area that very few people would normally have had access to, particularly not on a repeated basis. And it's interesting that when we first started finding orchids, I contacted the Wild Orchid Society, and one of their experts said to me that I would need to visit the farm and the farm area every 2 weeks between August and about March for several years to make sure I didn't miss anything. And that was specifically just looking at orchids, never mind all the other biodiversity in the area. So it's kind of a, it's been a pleasure. It's something we would have done anyway. And like a lot of the members of this club who bird for the sheer joy that it brings us, the big difference is that simply by keeping a record, accurate record of what you're seeing and where you're seeing it, you can actually add value as well. You can actually bring out important areas that are not currently recognized, but need to be recognized in terms of improved conservation, maybe just of birds. But one of the interesting evolutions of the important IBAs, they started out as important bird areas, but it became very clear that birds in this sense were acting as an indicator of a much broader and equally important biodiversity. So the technical term now is important biodiversity area. And I think, you know, our area, that little window on the Belfast grasslands, actually emphasizes how that works and how everything is interlinked. And yeah, Linda, have you got the question?
Yes, so Dr. Bing's question was, first, he thanks you very much for a great talk, but he wanted to know what's the status of alien species on the farm, and whether there's a predominant species, if any, that you're aware of.
Okay, the two most significant aliens are the two wattles, silver and black wattle, and one of the eucalypts. I'm not sure which it is. And their origin was originally sort of woodlots that were planted extensively in the grasslands. And we have managed, at least on our farm, to remove quite a lot of that exotic cover. It's a monumental job. It probably extended for maybe about a quarter of the total size of the area. But we've managed through, with help from Working for Water, amongst others, to actually push back in quite a few areas and restore areas of grassland. But things like pom-pom weed and stuff like that, which are a major threat to grassland diversity, fortunately have not stuck their head up. We're maybe just a bit far down the valley, because as you drive out on the N4, close to the highway on each side, you just see these seas of pink at the moment, and they're expanding rapidly. So yeah, the wattle and the wattle is probably the most invasive. The eucalypts don't tend to spread as aggressively. And our valley, the one in which our farm itself is located, is where most of the wattle is. Fortunately, the valley that I've tended to focus on, the one that runs south from the Bachendal War Memorial, that valley actually is pretty well pristine.
Fantastic. Okay, anybody else have a question for Geoff? Judy Stockhill had something to say in the chat. She said that the World Orchid Conference in 2014 was held in Sandton, and they did a pre and post conference tour to Fleur-en-Falais or Fleur-en-Flais.
Yeah, Fleur-en-Falais is one of the showcases for grass orchids, ground orchids. And on a good day, usually towards the end of December, maybe that last week between Christmas and New Year, it's possible if you know what you're doing, to actually pick up maybe as many as 25 different orchid species flowering. So it's incredibly diverse, incredibly rich. It has some of the highest grasslands in South Africa, or at least in Mpumalanga. And basically, it has a number of pretty unique species, which actually literally eke out a living on sheetrock right up at the sort of higher altitudes of the reserve. It's an incredible place. And one of the key things, and as I mentioned, I think to some of you early on, while we were just waiting for sign-ins, we're doing 2 walks there over this weekend. We're doing a botany walk on Saturday, and I'm doing co-leading a birding and botany weekend up there. And we're concentrating more on the birds on Sunday. And they've had things like white-winged flufftail, apit, falur, and fillet. Yeah. So it's a pretty special place. It's got a really healthy population of yellow-breasted pipits. It's got black rump button quail. It's got Denham's bustard, which is actually a bird on the back foot in most of the Mpumalanga grasslands. So really, really special reserve. And it's a closed reserve. So if you want to make a plan to go there, and I know the club did make a visit a couple of years ago, it is possible to actually book one of the guides and actually be shown around the reserve. And it's well worth it. It really is amazing.
Great, Geoff. I can't thank you enough. We love to go on a walk with you, whether we're looking at birds or butterflies or these wonderful orchids that you've discovered. Is there a book, a beginner's book of orchids that somebody like me could buy?
Linda, unfortunately, no.
Oh, really?
And I must admit, as a completely untrained non-botanist, orchids are a particularly tricky group. Fortunately, the kind of observational skills you need to actually make progress in successfully identifying birds, strangely enough, work for other things as well. So if you look at plants carefully, just like you're supposed to look at birds carefully, you can make headway. But for example, the habanerias, some of them are seriously tricky. And unfortunately, the one thing the plant people haven't done yet is used English to describe their topic. We, at least as birders, we came up with some seriously funny names for colors, but that's about as bad as it got. But the botanists have seriously complicated life. So I must admit, you know, each new orchid is a little bit of a kind of magical mystery tour through the guide, because we tend to do it the way we started birding. In other words, you go on color, and then you hope like hell that something looks familiar. And it's not quite that simple. So there's a really nice general book on all the orchids. And if you like us, as soon as you actually start, you'll start being aware of all these absolutely amazing things they find in the Cape. And, you know, you start planning your Cape trip so you can actually go and see rock jumpers and orchids and penguins and orchids and stuff like that. So getting the full Southern African orchid book is probably not a bad idea. But as I said, it does take quite a bit of getting into.
Sorry, I was muted. Thanks, Geoff, for that answer. I'm going to wrap it up now before everybody jumps off the call. And just to remind you about Geoff's Bird ID Improvers course on Saturday the 30th. Geoff and I are still trying to work out the the content 1, 2, and 3 for the day on Saturday, but I will be recording the sessions, so we will be able to refer back to them. And I know that it's going to give us these wonderful insights that not only can we see in Geoff being able to flesh out for us with the orchids, but certainly in terms of our feathered friends, our bird species. So if you would like to sign up, I still have a few places available on this course. So give me a call or drop me an email, and we'll do the necessary to register you for the course. But of course, Geoff, I can't thank you enough, and we so appreciate all the data that you and Cynthia record and submit as citizen scientists over all these years. You are a fountain of data, and it's going to the right place. Of course, the Rand-Barbet Bird Club is a donor to the Fitzpatrick Institute, where we are maintaining the database, or they are maintaining the database for SABAP2, which is the bird, logging the bird sightings, which helps so much in making a case for, what are we making a case for? For conservation of an area. So for instance, we would use that data to counter a wind farm application, for instance. And without that information, we would really be sunk. Yes, Geoff?
Linda, I'd just like to add a slightly different take on that. I don't know, one of the things, and this is where if you do something regularly, you're more likely to pick up changes. And one of the fascinating things for me has been over the last couple of years, let's call it 6 years, the change in the numbers and the variety of species of aerial insect feeders that I'm seeing here in Delta Park. Yep. So swallows and swifts, basically. And, you know, it's really interesting. And one of the values that the Atlas has, apart from, you know, highlighting priority areas for conservation, is that in real time, we can start seeing shifts in reporting rates of certain species. And that can highlight possibly some kind of environmental issue or something like that, which in many cases in other parts of the world, in England particularly, and in the States, they woke up one day and found in some cases that some of their more common bird species, the populations had declined by over 70%.
Exactly.
And so now, you know, just by watching, and, you know, you don't even have to count the swallows and swifts, but if you suddenly see that, you know, for example, the last couple of years, little swift has become scarcer and scarcer. Common house martin over Delta has all but disappeared altogether. And so now, you know, I'm at the point of contacting the FITS and saying, guys, this is what I'm seeing. How does that match up with the records over, let's say, Gauteng? And then what does that mean? Why is it changing like this? What's happened? What's going on? And so we could identify changes while they're happening, not after, and not try and figure out what went wrong after the pawpaw has hit the propeller. So that's another reason. So you don't have to tramp through the grasslands. You can do wonderful work in your own garden as long as you're consistent about it. That has incredible value.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much to everybody who attended this evening. Really loved seeing you, seeing your names, seeing your faces. And again, those of you who want to attend the outing at the end of the month, the 30th, please contact Duncan, or if you don't know who Duncan is, contact me. And Geoff, thank you again. We look forward to spending some time with you on Saturday, the 30th. Is it the 30th? Yes.
30th.
For our Bird ID Improvers course. So take care, everybody. Be safe. And we'll chat to you again on one of the various media.
Thanks from me as well. Cheers, everybody.
Everybody.
Bye now. Thanks, Linda.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks
Bye.
all.